Hello, this is it. The country's biggest contest, the fight for number 10. Rishi Sunak's sodden moment in the soaking rain wasn't the best of starts. Keir Starmer might have been surprised by the timing, but his message has long been clear. Now, over the next 6 weeks, the leaders vying for your vote will join us right here in our Sunday studio. And the politicians who are with us for our first encounter are the woman Rachel Reeves, who want to be in charge of the country's cash, and the Home Secretary, Conservative James Cleverly. You feeling nervous or excited, James?
Oh, no, I love elections. I'm a bit funny like that.
I think probably everybody here this morning is. Rachel, what about you?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to touring the country and getting Labour's message of change out to the voters.
OK, well, we're delighted to have both of you here with us this morning. But beware for the politicians, because our fact-checkers will be watching carefully everything they say on air each week. And every Sunday, the nation's election expert, Professor John Curtis, will keep us right on the polling numbers.
Mr Sunak needs either a record campaign swing or for the polls to be wrong and have their worst election ever.
And a wonderful array of well-known faces will join you and me to work out what's going on. And our first trio, Alan Johnson, former Labour Home Secretary, Baroness Nicky Morgan, former Conservative Cabinet Minister, and Sharon White, the boss of John Lewis. Welcome to you all. It's great to have you with us. And of course, the real magic of elections is that it's you that are in control. So stay with us. You don't want to miss a thing. Morning. So let's get started with what's making the news today. And the Conservatives' plan to introduce mandatory national service, whether military or community service for 18-year-olds, is splashed almost everywhere. Rachel Reeves, on the front of The Observer, accuses the Tories of promising to cut tax without saying where the money is coming from. And the tabloid splash on a different kind of story, the sad news that Eamon Holmes and Ruth Langford, a real-life TV sofa couple, are to split. So, the politics, the election, you don't really get bigger moments than this until the very end of the campaign, do you? Alan, what are you looking out for, really, in this 6 weeks?
In terms of Labour, of course, it's a long time since we were in government, so we have to convince the electorate that we're ready for government. That's what we failed to do spectacularly in 2019, failed to do in 2017, failed to do in 2015. So when you're part of a party and a party supporter that have seen those failures. I was the last Labour Home Secretary. I don't want to be the last Labour Home Secretary, if you know what I mean.
You sound like you're a bit traumatised in a way by all of those losses.
But not now. I'm much calmer now because I think it's not just the polls, it's this feeling that, the adults are in charge.
Nicky, what about you as a Conservative? You've been a loyal Conservative for a long time, and at the beginning, it looks very bleak, although I stress we're at the beginning.
Well, I think we are at the beginning. I'm actually very glad the election has been called. I was thinking it should be actually in May, and I think if that happened, we would have probably saved at least Andy Street. I think it's good that it's got underway. I think the big moments are going to be the TV debates. Mm-hmm. Although we in Westminster are always fascinated by Prime Minister's questions, most of the rest of the country, it's not a big moment. And so actually, I think for them to see, certainly the two main party leaders, answering questions, comparing them literally against each other is a big moment.
A lot of your colleagues, though, are feeling very, very, very despondent, and a lot of them are really cross that the election's called, and they think it's almost over.
Well, it's never over until literally 10 p.m. on election night. So until we see that exit poll, and that is another big moment for MPs. And it is spine-tingling. Yeah. And elections are an extraordinary moment. I understand why people are despondent, but equally, I do think it is time to take messages to the country.
OK, and Sharon, you come to us with all your insight as the boss of a big company, but also as a former senior Treasury economist. One of the things both parties are grappling with is a tricky situation in the economy. What's top of your list for politicians to explain in the next few weeks?
I think for either party, explaining that there's a plan that adds up. The last few years have been a torrid time, and I think a message for hope that businesses can invest behind. But we all know that public finances are not in a great shape with COVID and cost of living crunch. So a credible plan for how we get public services, how we get a great climate for investment, but the numbers have got to add up.
And as we speak today, on the first Sunday of this campaign, do the parties have credible plans?
I think it's going to be a big question over the next 6 weeks.
OK, I think that's a diplomatic way of saying not quite yet. We'll see what Rachel Reeves has to say later in the programme. We'll be back with you a bit later. And of course, you know, we love hearing from you. And the election is the moment when the power is in your hands. So do email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk. Or if you're social media inclined, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura K on X or Instagram. And if that's not enough, you can sign up to our weekly newsletter that will pop into your inboxes on Thursdays all the way through this campaign. Now then, let's get on with our first big interview of this campaign. Week 1, Sunday 1, the Home Secretary is here. Let's start with this big plan that's come this morning from the Conservatives. You're announcing mandatory national service for 18-year-olds. Now, back in the beginning of this year, the head of the army, General Patrick Sanders, suggested something like this, and it was dismissed by Number 10. So what's changed?
Well, what we're putting forward is a mandatory national service, a small element of which will be with the military, and anyone taking that route will volunteer to do so. So whilst you will be compelled to take part in the national service, no one will be compelled to do the military bit. And it's about addressing the fragmentation that we've seen in society. Too many young people living in their own bubble, whether it be a digital bubble or a social bubble. And we want to get back to the situation where people are mixing with young people from different areas, different economic groups, different religions, to try and find a way of addressing the kind of fragmentation that we see too much.
Sounds a bit like sort of social engineering. I mean, if the many thousands of teenagers don't want to go into the army, you've only got 30,000 places for people to go into the military. So the majority of them would take the other option. But what kinds of things would they have to do?
Well, it could be a range of things. It could be a kind of a uniform public service, whether it be something like a special constable or on-call firefighter or emergency health responder or environmental protection, flood defence work. So we're looking to keep this open because the important bit is about that societal coming together. That's absolutely key. And we are investing in these young people. We have allocated 2.5 billion towards this. It's fully funded. We've, of course, discussed with senior military leaders about the military element of it, and that will be slightly different. So it will be a year if you choose the military bit, it will be 25 days if you choose the more civil option.
You say it's fully funded, but you've said overnight that it will be funded by cracking down on tax avoidance, which Conservatives and other people have been saying. You've been trying to do that for 14 years, and it rarely has the...
No, we have been.
Well, it rarely has the impact that is hoped for.
So independent projections, not our figures, external figures, assess that we will be able to capture about £6 billion, 1 billion of which will be set aside for this.
Well, here's my wonder why you haven't been getting that over the last few years.
No, we have. So we have been much better than the Labour Party ever were at cracking down on tax avoidance.
But the other part of the money will come from what's called the Shared Prosperity Fund. And that was money that was allocated to be spent around the country, often in places where there's deprivation, often where there's a dire need for things to improve. And you're taking money from that to put it somewhere else.
No, we're extending it because it was going to come to an end. We're extending it by 3 years.
But you're spending it on something else.
But we are spending it in those places. So this money will be spent across the country. So that levelling up impact of the Shared Prosperity Fund will continue. We're investing not just in places, but in people in those places.
But you can't spend
We're
money
investing
twice.
in communities.
You've made a decision, and it may be the right decision, it may be the wrong decision, but you were spending it in a certain way on town centres around the country, and it might be spent in those same geographical locations, but it's being spent on something different.
So it was earmarked to finish. We're extending it. So what we're looking to do is we are continuing our commitment to levelling up. And as well as investing in places, we're investing in people in those places. And those people who want to argue that a government should not be investing in the young people in society, well, I'll be very interested in hearing that argument. Because this is about addressing an increasing phenomenon that we've seen recently, which is this detachment, this fragmentation. And look, I've been in the reserve forces for almost all of my adult life. I've seen people volunteer in a variety of functions around the country. I've never met anybody who regrets doing it, and I've met lots of people who say they wish they'd been encouraged to do so younger.
Volunteering isn't volunteering if it's mandatory. I mean, it's a bit like forcing people to, you know, if you're forcing teenagers to do something, they don't have a choice. Are you really comfortable as a Conservative who's meant to believe in, you know, liberal values, personal choice? You're forcing teenagers to do something.
We force people to do things all the time. We force 16-year-olds who, as a society, for example, we recognise are not fully formed and they still require education. So the decision was made that they remain in education or training. So we force teenagers to be educated. No one argues with that. I think we all agree that it's an investment in them. This is about maintaining that investment in young people, in the future of our society, in bringing people together, in pushing people sometimes out of their comfort zone, and perhaps pump priming a lifelong habit of volunteering, which is good for the individual and good for society.
Isn't this actually quite an obvious attempt to grab the attention of a certain kind of voter, as we've seen from some of the front pages today, that it sounds like a return to the good old days of bringing back national service? And when you look at the detail, as we've heard you explain today, actually it's nothing like it.
Well, we have always said this is a modern approach to a modern phenomenon. So some of it is about the military, and I, for example, have loved every minute that I've spent in uniform, but we totally recognise that is not for everyone, and we would never force anyone into the military. But there is a huge amount of community-orientated work. And as I say, whilst that first year, the 25 days in the first year will be compulsory, what we're hoping and expecting is that it will trigger in many, many people that lifelong commitment to volunteering, which is a huge benefit to society as a whole and to them as an individual.
Let's talk then about society as a whole in a different way. The Conservatives like to portray yourselves as the party of law and order. You're the Home Secretary. I like to show people what happened in the last year in England and Wales. Knife crime went up by 7%.
In London, run by Labour.
Gun crime went up by 9%. These are the ONS figures. Robberies went up by 13%. Shoplifting went up by 37%.
And
now, these are national figures from the Office of National Statistics.
They are national figures, but you know the distorting factor is London's impact. So let's take the top one.
No, Home Secretary, these are national figures from the Office of National Statistics. I would like you to answer the question. If the record shows that, why should people vote Conservative?
Let's take knife crime, the top one on your list. If you took Labour-run London out of the equation, that figure would be down. It is up, on that time frame, it is up by 22% in Labour-run London.
But these are the national figures overall.
Distorted by Labour's incompetence
since you have been in charge,
in London.
the number of crimes that are reported to the police nationally in England and Wales has gone up and up and up and up. Because
what we have said to the police, what we've said to communities, is we want people to report crime, and we've told the police they are to act on every crime report, every reasonable line of inquiry. But when you put these national figures, if you took the Labour-run City of London out of these figures, you would see a very, very different picture.
But you say you've encouraged people to report crime, rightly or wrongly. I think most people would think that was the right thing to do. But when people do report crimes, the rate of charge has also gone down quite significantly. It used to be, in 2015, that 16% of crimes ended in a charge. Now it's not even 6%. And we know many of our viewers feel sometimes they tell the police something and nothing happens. And also many of our viewers feel they don't even bother to call the police because they don't believe anything will happen. And
we have made sure the police are committed to pursue every reasonable line of inquiry. Now, of course, when the quantum of reporting increases, which, as you say, is a good thing, the quantum of charging can increase, but the proportion reduce. Now, I don't want to get tied up in the maths, but your fact checkers can address that. But the point that we're saying is I've instructed the police, as Home Secretary, to pursue every reasonable line of inquiry. We have made it clear that we are committed to tackling retail crime, for example. But we've also put more police officers on the street, an extra 20,000 police on the street
and on that,
to deal with it.
And on that, it's important to
in many
explain to our
areas,
viewers
in many
that the
areas,
proportion,
a record number of police officers.
On that point, it's very important to explain to our viewers that there are overall more police officers, but there are fewer officers per 100,000 people. There are fewer officers as a proportion because the population has increased, and that's a very important fact. But I want to ask you about something else that the
Crime
police
is
have been
reducing.
told to. 10 days ago, the police were told not to arrest people.
Not by
because
me, they
those
weren't.
jails
Not
are
by me,
full.
not by me, they
But
weren't.
that is the situation in 2024. The jails are so full that the police have been told by the national police chiefs
So the police have
not
told them
to make arrests.
So as you say, that letter that went out from police officers to another police officer is not the instruction I give. My instructions are clear: to pursue every reasonable line of inquiry, to make the arrests where arrests are needed. And the reason there is pressure on the prison estate is because during COVID, we decided to not ditch jury trials, and I think that is an important principle, and also to not prioritise the safety of prisoners above the general population.
Home Secretary,
so we didn't empty the prisons like other countries did.
COVID began 4 years ago, and you've been warned for months and months and months about the scale of the prison population. And the result has been that senior police officers decided that they didn't have a choice but to tell police officers not to make as many arrests as they might like. Is that something to be proud of?
Well, I've said that the instruction that I gave is that we do not stop arresting people.
But that's the situation that you preside over.
And what we're looking to do is make sure the people that should be in prison stay in prison. So we made sure that the people who are sent to prison for the most serious crimes, for rape, for murder, for serious sexual assaults, for attacks on children, that those people serve longer. And given the opportunity to make that decision, we would make that decision again. Okay. And if Labour are going to say that they are going to let those people out, again, OK, that's a conversation that's worth having.
We'll talk to Labour later in the programme, and I want to move on.
But we are determined that we will pursue every reasonable line of inquiry. We will put people through the criminal justice system.
I want to talk about immigration because our viewers care deeply about this. And you, as a government, have been talking about the Rwanda scheme for more than 2 years. And yet this year, we've seen so far a record number of people arrive in small boats making those dangerous crossings. More than 10,000, and that is up by a third compared to the same period last year. You haven't remotely got a grip of this, have you?
Well, look, what we have seen is a very challenging situation, and it's a global challenging situation. I discussed this with my international counterparts. No one is pretending that it is easy. But the Rwanda scheme is about adding a deterrent factor. The Small Boats Operational Command, which has been up and running for a year, has integrated our response across UK government and with our international partners.
But the numbers are going up, and you've been talking about this for years.
But we have set out what we're going to do, including at Rwanda, including the maintenance of the Small Boats Operational Command and other things to try and push these figures down. And compare that with Labour, who have said they're going to scrap the Rwanda schemes, they're going to do less. Their biggest announcement about immigration is the creation of a border command that already exists.
But James Cleverly, you've got more than 100,000
So they either didn't know,
people.
they either didn't know the Small Boats Operational Command exists, or they're lying to the British people about its existence.
You've got a record number
I'm curious as to which one.
We'll talk to Labour later in the programme. But you've got a record number of people having made the dangerous crossing across the channel.
And Labour say they're going to do less and somehow achieve more.
And you've got more than 100,000 people stuck in the asylum system. You've been in charge for 14 years. And there's more than 100,000 people stuck in the asylum system. There's a record number of small boat crossings, so it's up by a third compared to last year. Can you really look our viewers straight in the eye and say that you have got control of this system?
What we have set out is our plan. We are never going to put an amnesty for people that arrived here illegally.
Haven't you essentially done that? You've got more than 100,000 people stuck in the system, living in hotels around the country.
We have got the Small Boats Operational Command. It's been up and running for over a year, which Labour now claims it's going to reinvent or rename or fire and rehire. I don't know what they're planning to do. And we've got the Rwanda scheme and a whole load of other things that we are doing. this is an incredibly challenging situation,
and it's very difficult. But you haven't
it is
got
very
control
difficult,
of this,
and
have
which
you?
is why I think that the lack of a plan that the Labour Party have got is key. And the other point is, one of the reasons why Rwanda is not up and running, the Rwanda scheme is not up and running yet, is because over 130 times the Labour Party have voted against us toughening our border measures.
We're talking to Labour later in the programme, and I think
when you
our
do,
viewers during this
ask
election
them
want
about
to
why
hear
they're being
about
so
politicians'
dishonest about their
own
border
records.
command.
I think we want to talk about your own
and
record.
why they have
You
voted
been
against our proposals
Home
over
Secretary,
130 times.
You've been in charge for 14 years, your party has, and we want to hear how you describe and account for your own record. When it comes to legal migration, now, you were a proud Brexiteer. You campaigned alongside the big red bus. Legal migration that our politicians have control of has gone up to record levels. It's just come down. You've made some changes, but it's historically much higher than it was. It's been at 685,000 on the most recent numbers. 685,000 people legally coming here. Is that what people were promised by your government? When initially you said you'd get the numbers onto 100,000, during the referendum you said you would take back control, and then here you are with that size of number. Many of your colleagues in your own party believe that you've used immigration to get cheap labour into this country and to prop up the economies of universities around the country.
Well, since becoming Home Secretary, I took action in my first few weeks as Home Secretary. We're now seeing those figures coming down. What we have seen is visa routes which were designed to make sure that we had health and social care workers. What we actually have seen is those visa routes be utilised far more than we wanted, which is why we've tightened the measures on those. We have made sure with the minimum salary threshold that we are not importing labour which undercuts British workers. And once again, Laura, all those things opposed by the Labour Party. So we are taking action, and we have a plan, and we will set that plan out during this general election campaign, and people can judge. Again, no one's pretending this is easy, but we have set out a plan which has been opposed at every step by the Labour Party, who have now had this road to Damascus conversion to border control, when, as I say, they voted against every single one of our border measures over and over and over again. So we have a plan, and they don't. And they're not being honest with voters. And again, this border command
we'll be talking to Labour later in the programme, and you've made that point already. And our viewers want to hear about politicians' own records rather than just, you're entitled, of course, to go after your opponents. Labour will do that too, but people want to hear about your own record. On July the 4th, you're asking the public to give you another chance after a time in office when people have been relatively poorer, the NHS has got tougher, waiting lists have gone up, immigration much higher than when you took office in 2010. Can you really, hand on heart, not least because you've had 5 different prime ministers, tell our viewers this morning that this country is safer, better run than it was in 2010?
Well, we have had to deal with some unprecedented circumstances, including a global pandemic and a vicious war in Europe, 2 things which were completely unpredicted and unpredictable. And yet, our record is that the Prime Minister, when Chancellor, brought in the furlough scheme, which was not just about saving lives, but also about saving livelihoods. We had the world first vaccine rollout. I'm incredibly proud about that. We took the decisions to come out of lockdown, which meant that our economy is growing faster than most of our international comparators. If it hadn't have been for the public sector strikes, which Labour supported, waiting lists in the NHS would come down. And I was in Wales day before yesterday. NHS-run Wales, significantly longer waiting lists than the UK.
That many times.
So yes, I am proud of how we've dealt with and our support to Ukraine, these incredibly difficult issues. And we have a plan for the future. And the Labour Party have a vacuum where their planning should be. Tax black holes.
OK, we're going to talk to Labour later in the programme. It's great to have you with us here in the studio. A lot of your colleagues are off. Can I just check that you are still going to run as an MP?
Oh, God, yeah.
Okay,
Absolutely.
just wanted to check.
I love being an MP for Braintree. I love being a Home Secretary. I intend to be both after the next election.
Okay, James Cleverly, it's great to have you
Cheers,
here as to get going on this exciting election campaign. Well, let's go straight to our panel. Alan, who, of course, is a former Home Secretary, Nicky Morgan, and the boss of John Lewis, Sharon White. Nicky, then, firstly to you. James Cleverly saying there he thinks the Tories do have a record to be proud of, but what did you think of what he was saying, particularly about immigration?
Well, look, I mean, James is right. It is a very challenging issue and it is global. I think he's right that the Rwanda scheme is a deterrent, but it's in its very, very early stages. You know, but there are obviously a number of claims that remain unresolved, and that matters to the public. And as you said, Laura, it is an issue that resonates. You know, I was out and about yesterday, and for some voters, it is going to be the issue in which they decide the election.
Alan, you've got your arms folded there. Body language says a lot.
Did the best she could. Well, I think James is the 6th Home Secretary succeeding me. They cut police numbers by a 5th. They cut prison officer numbers by a 5th. We're talking about this front page story this morning about compulsory voluntary service. They cut army numbers by a 1/4. So if there's any argument here, it's how do you build up our armed forces, not how do you get 18-year-olds. I mean, from what I heard, this is compulsory volunteering. You know, it's very mixed up. It will never happen. It's just a front page story on a Sunday.
Do you think, Nicky, is that fair?
I don't think that's fair, and I understand why the Labour Party want to characterise it in that way. I think this is actually a scheme for young people. As a former Education Secretary, I think the more opportunities young people have to broaden their skills, particularly something like cyber, which actually set them up really well for the workplace, but also just broadening their horizons. This has got to be a good thing. And look, I think any parent of teenagers knows how they're stuck behind their digital screens, and actually the opportunity to get them out has got to be a good thing.
But they've got the opportunity now, Nicky. They've got the opportunity.
Well, they've got National Citizen Service. You can expand it.
This is about forcing people to do things.
Well, Sharon, I know as amongst your many professional accomplishments, you've also got some teenagers. I mean, what do you think of this idea?
So I have a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old. I mean, I think what's interesting both on the national, you know, conscription idea, but also on immigration, is that we're not spending enough time talking about skills and education. I mean, we run lots of apprenticeships actually for lots of 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds. May not be destined for university, may want to have a great career, but actually we want to have more apprenticeships, which at the moment are falling. And actually you've got businesses like ours and others that want to be investing more, but the way in which the financing works means actually there are fewer young people going down the apprenticeship route. So I'd like much more conversation about how we're improving the skills of our young people. And I think that also helps in the immigration discussion.
And Alan, how difficult, though, is it as a Home Secretary to get to grips with immigration? I mean, James Cleverly was very keen to say that, look, Labour doesn't have a plan that's very different to ours, apart from not doing Rwanda.
It's difficult, but we did it. I mean, took a long time for us to turn around those asylum claims. By the time we left government, we were doing 80% within 6 months. That's where the real problem is, because now it's taking 3 or 4 years. So, you know, by the end of our time in office, public confidence in the police was at its highest level. Police numbers were at their highest level. I would think after 14 years, you'd have had more to boast about than James managed to do just
OK,
then.
well, let's talk about the overall picture, because every week as we go along, we're going to get our panellists to give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down on what the parties have been up to so far, asking who won the week. Let's just give you a quick reminder. Rishi Sunak kicked it all off on Wednesday, of course, in the pouring rain. It didn't get that much better in the first couple of days when he went to Northern Ireland. He went to the Titanic Quarter and, unsurprisingly, was asked this.
Prime Minister, we are just yards away from where the Titanic was built and designed. Are you captaining a sinking ship going into this election?
So far, so smooth for Labour on the other side. Keir Starmer went straight off to one of his favourite locations, a football ground, of course, in Gillingham in Kent. But it may well not always be as smooth and happy as that as the campaign proceeds. The SNP First Minister, John Swinney, for his part, couldn't resist drawing attention to the election date. Just think about the 4th of July.
On July the 4th, Independence Day, make sure your voice is heard.
See what he did there? And Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, cracked on, touring their target seats in the south of England. Around 80 or so constituencies where the Lib Dems think they have a chance of outing the Conservatives. And we will, of course, hear from the Lib Dems, the SNP, the Greens and Plaid Cymru in the weeks to come. So, Nikki, let's put you on the spot first. Who won the week?
Well, look, I think the Prime Minister grabbed the attention, if you like, whatever won the week is going to mean, by calling the election. I mean, you know, apart from a very small group of people, he completely rocked Westminster and the country and has forced a lot of people to tear up their plans between now and the 4th of July.
Ellen?
He did grab the attention. I think I heard things can only get wetter in the background. That was a disastrous launch. They should have had it inside number 10. And I think that alone will be the image of that first week of.
I don't think you can have it inside number 10, can you? If it's a political announcement. I mean, that's one of the issues, wasn't it? I mean, the one thing you can't control this campaign is going to be the Great British weather.
He's the Prime Minister. Well, all right.
Sorry, even the Prime Minister can't control the weather.
Looking at that as a
somewhere indoors.
Looking at that as a voter, Sharon, who do you think won the week?
It's interesting. I just think about all the umbrellas we sell at John Lewis during the launch and the sort of drip dry suits.
Yeah, he's got a lot of umbrellas being offered.
I mean, I have to say, I think from the country's perspective, I think the fact that the elections have been called is a very good thing. I think uncertainty for all of us has been. Has been pretty wearing.
And what about what we've heard so far? So, I mean, if you forget about the weather malfunction, campaigns are long, there will be gaffes on all sides. In terms of what we've actually heard so far from the parties, has anything impressed you?
I think it's too early to judge. I think week 3, week 4 is when things always start to get a little bit interesting, particularly when announcements and plans really start to get scrutinised. So I'm holding my fire for a few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, the campaigns are long and we can't say that enough. Alan, briefly, what do you think the chances are of Labour having some kind of panic towards the end?
They won't have a panic, but there'll be a wobble. There's always a wobble.
A wobble, OK. A wobble,
sometime during and it's a 6-week campaign, so a very long campaign. And plenty of wobbling time.
And Nikki, what do you think the chances are of your party managing to pull it together? Because I know that, you think it's a good thing it's called the election, but a lot of your colleagues are very, very despondent.
Well, I think there's always an element of shock when an election is called, particularly when you don't quite expect it. And it means a lot, as you know, for employees of MPs and for candidates having to, uproot lives and everything else. They will get through it. And actually what the Conservative Party, does is when facing the country and the electorate, actually it will pull together. OK, we will see. Some advice there from our panel. But what is the overall picture? Every Sunday, we're going to ask the nation's favourite pollster and professor, Sir John Curtis, to keep us right on where the numbers are moving. And we've challenged him to tell us what you need to know in 60 seconds every Sunday.
The polls were not propitious. When rain-soaked Rishi Sunak announced a 4th July election, on average, they put his party 21 points behind. Conservatives were averaging just 23%, while Labour were on 44%. In Scotland, Labour are ahead of the SNP by 6 points and could gain 30 seats. To retain the keys to Downing Street, Mr Sunak needs either a record campaign swing or for the polls to be wrong and have their worst election ever. He will try first to squeeze Reform, who, with 11% support, have won over 1 in 5 2019 Tory voters. However, the first polls of the campaign suggest that support for Reform and Labour's lead are unchanged, and Mr Sunak simply cannot afford to be stuck in neutral.
Well, the big question, of course, is whether Labour can hold on to that lead and whether it is real when it actually gets to the ballot box. And their number one task has always been yours, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, to persuade our viewers you can be trusted with their money. It's a huge responsibility, so there's some huge questions for you. What would your priority be, first and foremost?
Well, first of all, we're really pleased to fight this election on the economy. That's why I'm here on the first Sunday of the election campaign, because after 14 years, the Conservatives have failed. It will be the first Parliament ever where living standards are lower at the end than they were at the beginning. And my number one commitment is to bring stability back to the economy. Stability is change. after 14 years of chaos and decline. And we'll do that with tough spending rules, a fiscal lock, so never again can a Prime Minister and Chancellor introduce a budget without an independent forecast. That stability is essential to allow families to plan for the future and for businesses to invest with confidence as well.
Straight out of bat there, though, you say you'll have tough spending rules. And the difficulty for whoever wins this election is to making the sums add up, to get debt falling, as you and the Conservatives both want to do. You're going to have to make very hard decisions. Will you stick with the Conservatives' spending plans that imply a big squeeze on public services?
Well, I totally agree that I have to show that the sums add up. It's what Sharon on your panel just said as well. And a former Conservative Chancellor said they didn't believe in abacus economics. Well, actually, I think being able to add up at the Treasury is absolutely essential. Now, you've asked about the spending rules. I've already announced an immediate injection of cash into our frontline public services over and above what the Conservatives have offered. So, for example, tightening up the rules around non-DOMs, cracking down on tax avoidance to fund those 40,000 additional appointments every single week in our NHS.
You know that the commitments you've made so far are tiny compared to the overall tax take, which is about £1 trillion. So will you stick with the broad shape of the Tories' spending plans? This is a fundamental question.
No, because I've announced these immediate injections of cash into our frontline public services. So another example, for example, is extending the windfall tax on the profits that the energy companies are making to endow a national wealth fund to invest in some of the low-carbon industries of the future, or 6,500 additional teachers in our state schools by introducing VAT and business rates on private schools.
But you know, Rachel Reeves, with your abacus, I don't know if you really have one or a metaphorical one, you know that those tax rises, the specific ones that you have announced so far, are tiny when you look at the scale of the overall budget and the overall challenge that does suggest, unless you tax a lot more or cut a lot more or borrow more, which you don't want to do, that you're going to have to cut services potentially quite significantly.
Well, I don't accept that 40,000 additional appointments a week in the NHS or 6,500 teachers in our state schools is small. But I am under no illusions about the scale of the challenge that I will inherit if I become Chancellor of the Exchequer in less than 6 weeks' time. A debt is almost 100% of GDP. The tax burden is at a 70-year high. We'll have to make difficult decisions, and we will not be able to put everything right straight away.
And difficult decisions mean that you are going to have to make spending cuts. Is that what you're saying? Because it's time to tell our viewers now we're in this campaign.
If you look at the government forecasts, real government spending will increase by 1% in each year of the next Parliament, in real terms. Now, I don't deny there'll be difficult decisions within that budget. I mean, Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt might come on this programme, if they do come on this programme, and say that everything is all OK. I'm not going to say that. I know our public services are on their knees, but that's why. So beyond that initial injection of cash, which is important because that will start to turn things around, we've got to grow our economy. We've got to unlock the business investment I know is there. Businesses want to invest, but they need that stability and they need that partnership with government to reform the planning system, the skills system, so that we can get that investment going.
And we talked about that at great length when you were here the last time and you explained that plan. But this is a really important question, and I think you're hinting at it, but not actually being candid about it. You say difficult decisions, you say tough decisions. That means outside of the health service, outside some other specific things that are always protected in government, it does it not, mean cuts to some public service spending?
Well, there's not going to be a return to austerity under a Labour government. Well, you know, we had austerity for 5 years, and that is part of the reason why our economy and our public services are in a mess today. There is no spending review. The government haven't done a spending review, so there's no allocations for departments. I would have to do that if I become Chancellor in a few weeks' time, and I'll set out those plans.
But
under Labour, we have got
public spending in some areas.
We're not going to be bringing back austerity, but we have got that immediate injection of cash into our frontline public services. That's a down payment on the changes that we want to make. But in the end, we have to grow the economy. We have to turn around this dire economic
And we will
performance.
move on, but this is an absolutely fundamental point. all sorts of economic experts, people like Paul Johnson, a very well-respected independent number cruncher. You look at the state of the books right now, the plans that have been set out imply very clearly that there will have to be cuts to some parts of public spending. And I'm hearing you not wanting to admit that, but you're also not ruling that out.
Well, we're in a very unusual situation where halfway through the year we have no spending plans for the next financial year, and that's because the government haven't done those plans. So I'll inherit a situation where there are no departmental allocations for any government department.
But I'm
so we will have to do that
what
spending
you would
review.
do, and that spending review. This is the question.
Yeah, so we'll have to do that.
Rule
that
out
spending
making
review.
cuts to public spending.
I don't want to make any cuts to public spending, which is why we've announced the immediate injection of cash into public services. So that money for our NHS, the additional police, 13,000 additional police and community support officers, and the 6,500 additional teachers in our schools, they are all fully costed and fully funded promises, because it's unless things are fully costed and fully funded, frankly, you can't believe they're going to happen. And our plans are all fully costed and fully funded.
But you don't want to make cuts. You don't want to borrow more. If you want to spend more on public services and you don't want to make cuts, then you could put up taxes. And some of our viewers think this is what you should do. Peter, who's retired, has told us, I want to pay more tax to ensure correct funding of local authorities and NHS. I want politicians not to treat me naively. So why not put up taxes? That's what the Tories claim you're going to do.
Well, there's nothing that will be in our manifesto that we haven't said where the money's going to come from. We've made those commitments. So, VAT and business rates on private schools, private equity bosses being taxed properly on their bonuses, an extension of the windfall tax so that the energy profits are properly taxed, ensuring non-DOMs pay their fair share of tax in the country they live in, and also cracking down on tax avoidance, which is costing our economy billions of pounds every year.
And they're not
Those are the commitments we have made, and that is what we will use to provide that injection of cash into public services.
What we want to know is what else you might do.
No, those are the commitments we've made, and that is how we'll fund them. And then beyond that, Laura, we have to grow the economy. It's why we've said we would reform the planning system so we can get Britain building again. It's why we'd introduce a modern industrial strategy to give businesses the confidence to invest. It's why, as Sharon said, we need to reform the apprenticeship levy so that businesses can invest in the skills that they need to help our young people succeed and get on in life. If we do those things, I know, because I've seen the huge potential we have as a country, we can grow our economy. And that is the way that we can improve living standards and also have the money for public services. And there are no shortcuts here. That's the key point. There are no shortcuts.
And
we have to grow the economy.
But you cannot guarantee that you can grow the economy. And you also can't guarantee, as this government has discovered, that there might not be some terrible emergency, another conflict, another war, the pandemic, of course, which hit them like out of the blue sky, which cost a huge amount of money. But what we're trying to get at on behalf of our viewers is what you would do to their pay packets, to their wallets. Would you rule out putting up income tax?
Well, I want, and Keir wants, taxes on working people to be lower. And we certainly won't be increasing income tax or national insurance if we win the election.
So that's a clear commitment. You will not increase income tax?
No, we won't increase income tax or national insurance. In fact, we opposed the increases to national insurance when Rishi Sunak put those forward as Chancellor. We would like taxes on working people to be lower, but unlike the Conservatives, who have already racked up £64 billion of unfunded tax cuts in just 3 days of this campaign, I will never play fast and loose with the public finances. I will never put forward unfunded proposals.
You know very well, Rachel Reeves, that what you call unfunded tax cuts are the potential costs of long-term aspirations of the Conservatives,
in the last
which
few
are
days,
not
Laura,
that different. No, let me make this point, because it's important. The Conservatives have said over time they would like to phase out national insurance, which would cost a huge amount of money, but over time, you in the Labour Party also want to do other things over time, like maybe changing tuition fees, cutting them, or maybe getting rid of the two-child benefit cap. over time. Those are also hugely expensive things that you might like to do over time.
And we won't put anything in our manifesto where we can't say where the money's going to come from. But in just the last 3 days, we've had £46 billion commitment from the government about getting rid of national insurance altogether. The Telegraph interview yesterday with the Chancellor spoke again about getting rid of inheritance tax that he said
I'd
was
like
an
our viewers to be
unconservative,
absolutely clear
thing,
that those are
and also
long-term
marginal rates of
aspirations.
income tax.
I'd like our viewers to be absolutely clear. Those are long-term aspirations that the Conservatives are putting forward.
And if they are in the Conservative manifesto, they must be fully funded.
And we've spoken to James Cleverly already, and as he was trying to push everything onto you, as he heard rivals, you are trying to put a lot of things onto him, and of course you're entitled to do that, but our viewers want us to look at what you are putting forward.
And everything in our manifesto will be fully funded and fully costed. That's a really important principle.
Well, let's talk about one of them. Let's talk about one of them specifically then. At this time, a lot of people are very worried about the security of the country. You've said you want to spend 2.5% of the whole size of the economy on defence in time. By when?
We're not going to put a timetable on that. We've committed to
not even in the manifesto. You're not going to put a time on it.
in government a strategic defence review to make sure that we're getting value for money for all of our spending, including on defence, where some of the procurement costs of purchasing new equipment have frankly got out of control under this government. So we'll do a full strategic defence review. But again, I'll just come back to this point. If you're going to say that you're going to spend a certain amount of money on something, you have to be absolutely clear where the money's going to come from.
But it's not
a
real
think the
commitment.
Conservatives can be honest
But then
about
it's not
that.
a real commitment from the Labour Party to spend 2.5% because you're going to have a review if you win the election, just to be clear.
Well, Keir said even before this government said that we want to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence. And in fact, when we were last in government, we did spend 2.5% of GDP
But it's not. But in the
on
context of
defence.
an election campaign, unless it is a firm commitment, it is not something that our viewers can trust in.
Well, it's where we would like to get to, and we'll get there as quickly as possible. But I don't think anybody can have any faith in a commitment where there's not money on the table. And that's the problem that the Conservatives are getting into, whether it is this promise today around national service, where you're robbing one budget to pay another, or what the government have said about defence spending. We have always backed the government over the last, this Parliament, whenever they've wanted to put more money into defence, whenever they've supported Ukraine, whenever they've supported NATO. We will always put our national security first. But it is really important to make sure that the sums always add up, because when they don't, you go down this Liz Truss route where you promise a load of stuff and all you end up doing is pushing up interest rates, pushing up people's mortgage costs, putting pensions in peril and taking us backwards as a country. And I will never do that with the public finances.
You mentioned there the National Service Scheme. I just wonder, would Labour support that?
This is just another gimmick a desperate gimmick from the Conservative Party with no viable means of funding it. You know, one minute they say that levelling up is really important, and then they raid the levelling up budget and say it's going to be used for national service. It's just another example, I'm afraid, of a gimmick where the sums don't add up.
Are you sure that overall you have your approach right? I mean, Gordon Brown, who I know you admire, former Labour Chancellor, former Prime Minister, he said in terms that the two-child benefit cap, where big families can't get extra entitlement to benefits, should go. He's spoken very passionately about child poverty. If you win, is your and Keir Starmer's government going to be a Labour government that chooses not to help those thousands of families in grinding poverty?
The Labour Party in government will reduce child poverty. We've set out just this weekend, for example, the New Deal for working people to ban exploitative zero-hour contracts, to end the scourge of fire and rehire, to turn the minimum wage into a real living wage, to give dignity to people, particularly in low-paid and insecure work. Those are just some ways in which we are going to begin to tackle child poverty.
But it's interesting you mentioned that, because Gordon Brown, who knows about trying to add the sums up, and as the Labour Chancellor going into 1997, hoping to move into number 11, he said he wouldn't raise income tax. He said he would stick to Tory spending plans. And yet now he's saying, you've got it wrong on the two-child benefit cap.
We're not going to be able to put everything right that the Conservatives have done straight away. And our priority is reducing those NHS waiting lists, because we've got people, in some cases, waiting for more than a year, in some cases more than 2 years for procedures. There's so much that we want to turn around, and we have to prioritise. Okay. And our priority would be those additional appointments in the NHS to cut those waiting lists and for those additional teachers in our state schools to give every child the best possible start in life. And those will be our priorities.
And you've made that point. Let's talk there about workers' rights, because you mentioned that. And you say that there's a ban on 0 hours contracts and a ban on fire and rehire. And Jonathan Ashworth, your colleague, sat there last week and said, yes, we are banning fire and rehire. Except the plan for workers' rights was published late on Friday night. And it makes very clear that firms can do fire and rehire, where they get rid of staff and then get them back on the books on worse conditions. It says very clearly that they can do it if there are particular circumstances and as long as they follow a process.
Well, wait a second, Laura. We say in that document we will end fire and rehire. But when a company is facing bankruptcy and there is no alternative, they will have to consult with their workers and with their trade unions. Those are very, very limited circumstances. We will end fire and rehire, which has seen companies like P&O sack all their staff and then try and bring them back on worse contracts. That is deplorable, and we will not allow that to happen.
But you have said that firms can do it if there is restructuring. And I've been speaking to one of your biggest union backers, Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of the Unite Union. She told us that she will not support the proposals as they exist. And she believes that you have broken a promise. She says, how can you justify rowing back on your commitment to have an outright ban on fire and rehire? Allowing a company to do it if they're restructuring is not a complete ban. It's not.
But we've worked on these proposals with our trade union colleagues. I'm sorry that Sharon feels like that, but we do have the support of our trade union colleagues. And I believe that this is the biggest ever extension of workplace rights that's ever been introduced, if we have that opportunity to do so. So we will get rid of fire and rehire. We will get rid of exploitative 0 hour contracts. And we will bring forward that legislation to Parliament within the first 100 days of a Labour government. And I'm really excited to do that, because if we're going to grow our economy, we've got to ensure that working people have the security and the dignity of a job that pays a decent wage and where they can plan from 1 week to the next because they know the number of hours they're going to be doing. And that is an important part of our growth strategy. It's pro-worker. I also believe it's pro-business, because I believe that most businesses do not employ these sorts of tactics. But sometimes they're undercut by bad employers that do.
OK, well, if you make it into office, it will be interesting to see how those proposals unfold. And I know that the unions will be watching very, very closely indeed. Lastly, you've joined us here in the studio many times. Next time you're here, if everything goes your way, you will be Rachel Reeves, Chancellor of the Exchequer. What goes through your mind when you hear those words?
Well, I've been an MP now for 14 years, and I think I probably came on the predecessor to this programme not long after I was first elected. So I've been through a lot in those years. The Labour Party's been through a lot. The country has been through a lot. The one job that I've always wanted to do is to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. I was an economist at the Bank of England for many years before I became an MP. I worked in financial services. I know how to run a successful economy. I just want the chance to be able to do that and turn this economy around so that it actually works for working people in our country again.
Do you think you're going to make it?
We're not complacent. We're fighting for every single vote. But for the first time since I've been an MP, I believe we're in touching distance of doing this.
OK, Rachel Reeves, it's always great to have you with us in the studio. Thank you very much indeed. And we'll see what the next few weeks bring. Well, like you at home, we have been listening very carefully to Rachel Reeves' claims and James Cleverly, the Home Secretary's too. And we've been doing some checking of the facts. Now, James Cleverly told you that if you exclude London from the statistics on knife crime, the number of offences was falling in England and Wales. And London is by no means, though, the only place where knife crime went up. In fact, it was up in more than half of police crime areas. When asked Rachel Reeves about her plans for public spending, she pointed out there are currently plans for real terms increases of 1% for public spending across the board. That is true, but experts like the Institute for Fiscal Studies have looked at the figures, and they say clearly once you factor in spending commitments for departments like the NHS, which are protected, some departments will face cuts on current spending plans. So that's our first fact check of the election. Let's get back to our panel, who will have been listening intently to Rachel Reeves. Alan Johnson, do you think, as somebody who was around in the Labour days of '97, when you said clearly you were going to stick to the Tory spending plans, Do you think the position they've got themselves in, where they're taking really quite a similar approach, apart from on a few billion here and there, do you think it's the right one?
Yes, if Rachel does come back on your programme as Chancellor of the Exchequer, of course, she'll be the first woman ever to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I think you saw there someone who's really concentrating on what's good for the country. That question on child poverty was a really good question, Laura, because we committed to eradicating child poverty by 2020. It was a big, big pledge. We'd halved it by 2010 when we were voted out. And every fibre of Rachel's being, and I know her very well, would have wanted to say yes to your question, will you tackle that? Will you get rid of the two-child policy, which actually contributes towards child poverty? And yet she restrained herself. And that restraint, because she knows that the figures have to add up, and previously at general elections, that's not always been the case. You quoted Gordon Brown. He presided over 47 successive quarters of growth. We have a record on this, and I think Rachel's very good to take that
Sharon,
forward.
Is it right, do you think Labour have chosen to kind of climb into a straitjacket here? Could they take a different approach from your view, or is this the right way to go?
I mean, it's interesting that Alan talks about 97. I was a non-political civil servant in the number 10 policy unit working for Tony Blair. And the economic inheritance was just very different. I mean, growth was stronger, the economy was stronger. And I think that the most important thing is that there's an open and transparent debate about the choices and trade-offs.
And was that open and transparent? You could hear Rachel Reeves really not want to admit to the fact that if you look at the books now, it does look like they're going to be really quite painful cuts.
It is a very tough inheritance for any new chancellor to inherit. Debt is over. We've got more debt in the country than we've got size of economy. And so whether it's, I think one of the issues is just as the election campaign runs on, is that politicians on either side don't get themselves into such a straitjacket or box themselves in either on tax pledges or spending pledges that either you're having to row back on once you're in power, or indeed you give yourself such limited room for manoeuvre.
Nikki, what did you think of what you heard there?
Well, I liked the suffragette colours that she was wearing, but I think there were a lot of unanswered questions. I mean, she's right to say that what is needed is a proper spending review, and that's one of the things about having election at this point in the year, is that you've got the autumn to do that, so government departments can have
and that's when the Treasury sits and looks at everything.
They look at, exactly, and I think we haven't had multi-year spending reviews for a while. And the reason that's important is two things. One is the VAT on schools policy, school fees. Think of that what you may, but the point is, I understand it's going to raise less than £2 billion, which is not going to cover the school places needed if people leave the independent system and go into the state system. And so that is an area that, for example, isn't explained in terms of those spending commitments. But the other thing, actually, you did push her on, which is right, is the workers' rights. She didn't talk about the fair pay agreements, their proposal for sectoral pay agreements, which I think actually would be of great interest or probably concern to business. She cannot grow the economy. We can have more productivity without business being at the heart of that.
And we're almost out of time. Let's ask a big business. I mean, there were those plans for additional rights for workers. Are they a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, I mean, I know lots of businesses are very worried about this. I'm probably in a much more pragmatic camp. I think as the economy and the country sort of recovers from the last few years, there's got to be a fair share between workers, business, the public at large. So I think done in a careful, consultative way with business, I think I'm much more open.
OK, I'm almost out of time, but Alan, as you're here, I know you had passionate views about what happened to your party when Jeremy Corbyn was in charge. What do you think of him standing as an independent in Islington North?
I think he's been an independent on our benches for about the last 40 years. So I don't think there'll be much change there.
OK, all right, all three of you. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. You've been a great trio getting us kicked off at the beginning of this campaign. You've been busy getting in touch, which we always like to see. On national service, Richard Warner says, I've got a better idea. All MPs and Lords should do national service, including the Prime Minister. But Angie Davies says, I would encourage 18-year-olds to view this as a country investing in them. Contributing to society is very rewarding. Kevin Jones, though, said, I want to vote Labour, but not for a Labour Party cutting public expenditure. They won't tell me what they're going to do. So lots of lively debate already. There's going to be so much more in the weeks to come. Thank you very much to all of my guests for being here, and most of all, to you for watching at home as we start the countdown to the moment when you will decide who will run the country. The two big tribes have had very different starts, but it's early. And what all of the parties, big and small, are very aware of is that campaigns can feel very long and you voters can be a volatile bunch. Join me and Paddy O'Connell later on BBC Sounds for Weekend Newscast if you can. Everything's on iPlayer as ever, and I will look forward very much to seeing you next Sunday, same time, same place.